Well, I'm Mark Pullen. I'm Vice Chair of the Technology Policy Council. I'm sure you know the Technology Policy Council is IEEE-USA's voice at a national level, presenting our considered opinion in the form of position statements and testimony to the Congress, and work with the executive branch as well. I have for a number of years held the opinion that we ought to get the Tech Policy Council and PACE closer together, that there are a lot of opportunities here for grassroots activities, because after all, as a democratic nation, the United States has representation in the Congress from people who also have district offices and are very eager to hear what people have to say locally. In fact, give a lot more credibility to local folks. So I got an opportunity this year to perhaps get these ideas before PACE, because I was asked to find the Tech Policy Council's speaker for this plenary, and when Charles said that there's no problem with a provocative speaker would like one, why, I said I know just what we need to do, and I spoke to my friend Jim Gover. Now, if you've looked at my biographical sketch, and you probably haven't, but something is missing there in the effort to get it under a half page. We left out the fact that a long time ago I was a congressional fellow for IEEE. So I've kind of kept close to the people who have done fellowship since then. And our speaker for this session is one of those people. In fact, he's been several kinds of fellow, including fellow of the IEEE. He is a strong background in technology, master's degree in electrical engineering and a PhD in nuclear engineering from the University of New Mexico. And he's worked at Sandia National Laboratories since that time, when he hasn't been working for IEEE, that is, because he is one of us who does a lot for the IEEE, and that would include the technical side, where he has had an active technical role through the Nuclear and Plasma Sciences Society. But more to the point, for PACE, Jim Gover served as a congressional fellow of the House Science Committee in '88, and then again as a competitiveness, always trip over that one, a competitiveness fellow from '92 through early '95, first with Senator Roth, and then later with the Department of Commerce Technology Administration's Office of Technology Policy. So you're about to hear from a well-grounded individual, and as I have indicated, it's likely to be provocative. I challenged Jim a couple of weeks ago to get this thing focused as much on PACE as possible. In fact, I think you'll see his first slide indicates that focus. Without taking any more of the time then, since we have a lot to get done, not only in Jim's talk but afterward, I will turn the podium over to him, and also ask that in order to keep things flowing, that we reserve our questions for the end. I believe there will be some time after Jim's talk and before Joel takes over. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Let's start by doing a poll. First of all, how many of you are concerned? Now leave the first overhead up. Thank you. Let's do a poll. How many of you are concerned about the government's recent cuts in R&D spending? We heard about that at lunch. How many of you think that technology policy should only be made by lawyers? Okay. So you're interested in technology policy, but how many of you, let me ask you a third question, how many of you recognize and are already aware of the fact that technology policy is largely made by lawyers? That's what we're going to talk about for the next 30, 40 minutes. I'd like to see you making technology policy, not lawyers. In discussing the issue of technology policy and strengthening IEEE's role in it, I want to carry parallel discussions of four issues and institutions. The two institutions I'll be looking at are IEEE and the U.S. Congress. The two issues I'll be looking at are health care and science and technology policy. Now, I see these four matters, issues, and institutions all being closely linked. And what happens in one area is going to affect what happens in the other three. I will be recommending actions that PACE can take to get more involved in policy development. In addition, I want to review ways that IEEE-USA can make better use of its people, journal, and conference resources. At the end, I propose that we develop an implementation strategy before we leave the meeting today. I've been frustrated by too many IEEE meetings where we talk about issues, wring our hands a little bit, and then leave, and nothing happens. So I've taken this on with the hope that we'll actually do something. Throughout these discussions, I emphasize the need for IEEE-USA to provide Congress with research-based knowledge rather than just opinions. If PACE is to influence technology policy, it must be armed with facts, not just opinions. I think we engineers need to face up to the fact that we're not always highly regarded by the rest of society. In too many cases, engineering is viewed as a threat, just as the Luddites decided that textile engineers were restoring their jobs. One of the strongest spokesmen for engineers, Norm Augustine, the president of Lockheed Martin, has observed and written about the plight of engineers and how engineers must first join society if they're going to influence it. He's advocated activist political roles for engineers. He's also advocated a significant revision of the engineering education program in this country to better prepare engineers for political roles. He advocates that engineering education must not only emphasize facts and technology, it must teach the political process, and it must develop communication skills among engineers. He also proposes that educators emphasize systems engineering, and to me, systems engineer is a euphemism for holistic thinking. Think about the whole system. That is in part a justification that I have for wanting to discuss healthcare, technology policy, Congress, and IEEE all in a parallel vein. I recommend that Augustine's writings, he has about 4 or 5 papers in the 1994 fall issue of The Bridge. I would recommend that those be distributed to our sections, particularly if you have sections that don't feel strongly about engineers getting involved in the political process, because Augustine has done some excellent writing on that, and is one of the few engineers in this country that I've found that's made important contributions to that thought. Next overhead. My vision is that IEEE members use their analysis and synthesis skills to help their nation shape the technology policies it needs to move into the 21st century. However, I would also like to see IEEE members, not just in the U.S., but IEEE members around the world, involved in their nation's political processes. Particularly, I'd like to see them helping their nation develop technology policies. I believe that now is the time for action by U.S. members. Our national technology policy is in a state of turmoil, and there's always opportunities during turmoil to influence direction. And then there's plenty of opportunities right now for political activists. So I would argue that our nation really needs your help. It needs it now. And you need, for our nation, to develop rational policies towards science and technology, because your future is at stake. So I see there's a win-win situation for IEEE engineers, and there's a win-win situation for the nation. In survey after survey, our members demonstrate that they are very much concerned about technology policy, about employment opportunities, about age discrimination. they're concerned about pension issues, and they're concerned about other matters as well. What I think sometimes engineers fail to recognize is that resolution of these concerns all require political activity. They will not be solved external to the political system. The Washington office of IEEE-USA and IEEE-USA committees, they can testify at hearings, they can provide other information to Congress, but their influence pales in comparison to that of a membership that's politically active at the local level. If you go talk to your congressman, I assure you he will take it, or she will take it very, very seriously, much more so than a stranger from IEEE headquarters coming over and leaving a document. Because our political process, our political system is designed to respond to constituent needs. And so talk to those members that are responsive, particularly to you, and you will have great influence. Therefore, it's my goal that IEEE chapters and sections get tired of letting Washington's inside the Beltway lawyers make all the decisions that shape the future of engineers in the United States. You may find this difficult to believe, but the fact is, almost all the government's technology policy offices are run by lawyers. The Technology Administration's Office of Technology Policy, Office of Technology Commercialization, doesn't have a single technologist in the office. It makes me sick when I think about how little influence engineers have in our society. On the other hand, I believe it's due largely to the fact that engineers have chosen to not be a part of our society and to not attempt to influence society. So I would argue it's now time to get involved in politics, and my strong recommendation is that you do it at the local level where it can have the most impact. And I want to remind you of a statement that Tip O'Neill made a few years ago, when he said, all politics is local. It's not in Washington, it's at the local level. That's where the most political influence can be wielded. To reach this vision, I believe that IEEE-USA must provide our membership with policy ideas that they can get excited about. Ideas that challenge your reasoning skills is what's going to get you excited. Ideas that are based on the scientific method, not unresearched assertion. I call these knowledge intensive. So the model that I'm thinking about IEEE-USA for the future is that our committees and other institutions within IEEE will do research that you can look at and say, hey, I think that's a very rational piece of work, it makes sense to me, and then you'll take it to your local members of Congress, and it will be yours then to sell and to perpetuate. The international side of IEEE needs to also see the light and quit treating policy as if it were an unwelcome, impure country cousin. To be effective, we have to learn to integrate policy issues with our science and technology policy resources. These are partners, not disjoint, separate enemies. Science and technology policy, I like to think of them as siblings that should not be separated just because one of the parents is ill. And certainly, technology policy is ill today. I believe the outcome of this will be increased member interest in policy and a dramatic increase in the political influence of IEEE groups around the world. Now I would like to review for a moment the current status of the two institutions, IEEE and Congress, that I'm talking about, as well as the two issues, healthcare and technology policy. And I think the interrelationships between these four areas will become clear. IEEE-USA members are worried about employment availability, income, and work environment, and they're telling IEEE-USA to help them by influencing U.S. technology policy. Corporate downsizing to increase competitiveness and reductions in defense procurement have really stressed our membership. It's clear that the competitive resurgence of U.S. companies has brought rewards to only a select few of our members. By far, the majority have not benefited from this resurgence of U.S. corporate competitiveness. Unemployment and age discrimination in the workplace are also growing concerns that our membership repeatedly attests to in the surveys. For IEEE-USA to respond to members' wishes and increase its influence on U.S. technology policy, just as this technology policy is undergoing unprecedented change, requires that our members become involved in policy matters at the local level. They must bring their unique skills to bear on the development of national technology policy. Let me share with you a personal experience I had in Senator Ross' office. After working there for almost 2 years, I left. Their administrative assistant called me in. He said, "You've had a profound impact on our office, not so much in what you did, but in the way you have caused us to think about things." And as we talked about at length, what I got from the discussion was that they were so used to using political processes that when I injected the scientific method and started to do analysis on the details of competition among U.S. companies and looking for root causes, they'd never seen that done before. And he liked it and encouraged me to continue to do that. I think engineers in general can bring that kind of thinking into the policy development process. See, the political process was largely based on undefended opinions. You poll, and then you do what the consensus suggests that you should do. Well, that's not the kind of thinking that engineers are well grounded in making. We can have our opinions, but what we can do is bring to the process something far more profound than just idle opinion. So for this to happen, I see that IEEE-USA needs to shift from just an assertion-intensive policy perspective to a knowledge-intensive policy perspective. And that if we can do that, I think that will differentiate us from every other lobbying institution in the country. And again, as a congressional staffer, I can tell you that it was rare any lobbyist ever brought me anything that I found to be very useful. For the most part, their opinions were very, very shallow and not well thought out. So I would claim that any lobbying institution that can bring in-depth knowledge to Congress will find its influence very much differentiated from those of other institutions. Next paragraph. Why am I even raising the question of health care? What in the world does that have to do with any of this? I argue that most Americans don't understand that the economic consequences of our health care costs have reached what I would call the grave state, and that furthermore, the political risk that members of Congress face by attacking this issue are very, very high. It's in the state of New Mexico, our Senator Pete Domenici, who chairs the Budget Committee, who is very, very highly regarded in New Mexico, therefore I would argue his future is pretty secure. He's taken a great political risk in just raising or introducing the idea that he's going to cut Medicare growth rate from 11% a year to 7% a year. Very high risk associated with that. And I will predict that if Republican members of the U.S. Senate don't get reelected over that issue, you're going to find Congress getting even more sensitive and conservative about what they deal with that issue. But I would make the following point. I consider that it's bad enough that lawyers are making our technology policy. Now doctors and hospitals are taking 15% of our stagnated incomes. And every 20 months, they get another percent. That's the rate at which health care costs are growing in this country. It's the growth in Medicare and Medicaid costs that's making it so hard for Congress to balance the budget. Just cutting their cost growth from 11% per year to 7% per year has really scared Congress. And these so-called young Turks that were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, when the Senate came back with a plan to cut Medicare and Medicaid growth to 6%, they said, "Gee, aren't you guys getting a little bit too aggressive? Let's back off." And I think they backed off to about 7.2%. But people are concerned about this in the political system. If it wasn't for increasing health care costs occurring during a time of growing pressure to balance the budget, national technology policy would be healthy and wealthy, but I would argue not necessarily wise, but it would not be under the high stress that it's under. Congress is trying to balance the budget. They're trying to trade off controlling growth in Medicare and Medicaid. They're not willing to touch Social Security. The political risk of that would be totally fatal. And so they're cutting discretionary accounts, and R&D is one of those discretionary accounts that's taking a big hit. At the congressional level, the future of technology policy looks pretty bleak. We heard the luncheon speaker talked a bit about that. It's Congress's perception that the American people want the federal budget to be balanced. To do this, Congress has to cut spending in the discretionary accounts and attempt to control spending growth in entitlement accounts. Discretionary funding for research and development is undergoing major cuts, and even bigger cuts are projected. Some are even talking about federal R&D spending, which is about $70 billion a year, in a few years being as low as $50 billion a year. Support for commercial technology in particular is experiencing massive cuts, as is R&D for energy and the environment. On the entitlement side, Congress is just experimenting with restricting the cost growth of Medicare and Medicaid. For federal R&D to survive the scrutiny that Congress is imposing, it must be built on a firm intellectual framework, must be defensible against the accusations of critics, and most importantly, it must serve the interests of the American public. I believe that Congress will not hesitate to spend $1 of public funds when it can be shown that in return the public receives $2 in value. The problem is, most of the time it's perceived by the public and therefore by Congress, which I would argue is almost always some form of a mirror of the public. Most of the time it's perceived that when you spend $1 of public funds, the public gets back about 10 cents on their investment. And therein lies the problem. What's the current state of technology policy? During the late 1980s and early 1990s, Congress created several programs that were intended to support commercial technology. You know them as ATP, TRP, SBIR, TTI, and a bunch of other alphabets. Now, Congress at the time, the vision of Congress was that these programs would benefit not just commercial technology, but most of all, they wanted these programs to benefit the public. And that's why you heard so much talk about jobs. Congress wanted jobs in the private sector. Good, high-paying jobs is what they wanted for their constituents. That's what they expected these programs to produce. They wanted jobs that engineers could fill and other well-paid professionals. Some of us think that the agencies, and I'm certainly among those, forgot that these programs needed a strong intellectual framework and that they needed to benefit the public. Agencies were so busy implementing programs they forgot to think. It's as if thinking was, in many times in federal agencies, it seems that thinking is considered to be an unnatural act. A Congress that finds itself in the position of cutting programs that the public likes determines these programs to be easy targets. Congress knows that they won't hear many complaints from the passive technical community, what I call the silent majority. Some think of them as the geeks and nerds that would rather find fault with society than become a member of it. For years, government thought that we technoids were kind of a tolerable part of our society. A little nerdy, maybe social misfits, but otherwise okay. Don't create too many public disturbances. Shove a little money under the door and maybe we'll come up with something that'll help us constituent make a lot of money. Go, technoid, go. That's the way lots of people outside of our profession looks at us. And what we're finding out in IEEE, if you haven't turned the world upside down by the time you're age 40, we'll throw you back in. You're not really a keeper. Ladies and gentlemen, I would argue that we've lived the good life. We haven't needed IEEE to do anything for us other than help us gain access to the best technology. What we really needed from IEEE over the past 40 years has been literature, conferences, an opportunity to share our ideas with other technical people. I think we're moving into a new era. IEEE's responsibilities, I see, as far more important to our futures than it has been in the past. IEEE's provided us with a conference here, a workshop there, and short courses everywhere. And by the way, something for unemployed engineers to put on the resume, hoping that would help. We haven't needed to get our hands dirty with state and national policies. Besides, we've all seen enough politics in IEEE and in the workplace to take care of our political needs for the rest of our life. So we've avoided it. I believe those days are over. The only thing that I can think of that's better than working for a $1 trillion monopoly, and that's what healthcare is having a spouse that is brilliant, attractive, affectionate, and rich. Do you know what a $1 trillion monopoly does when it's under political attack? It lobbies, and it works. Spend a few $1 million here, a few $1 million there, get a few doctors elected to the House and Senate, and first thing you know, what happens? Nothing. We get to continue our monopoly because we recognize how the political system worked, and we influenced it, and that's basically what's happened in the last couple of years. If engineers were as politically active as doctors, the politicians wouldn't take us so lightly. We would be doing R&D on an automobile that runs all day on 8 glasses of water and 4 aspirins, and we'd be making so much money we could afford to hire our own lawyer. Wouldn't that be wonderful? At cocktail parties, we could walk up to people and say, "Our counsel recommends." That sure sounds a lot better than "my loan officer demands." Except for President Clinton, every president since President Nixon has looked at the health care problem and said, "I'll just let the next guy handle this one. If I have any extra time, I'll do a talk show. Get me on Oprah." I'm very concerned that President Clinton's ill-fated attempt to deal with the health care cost problem caused him so much political damage that that issue will go into hibernation for another 4 to 6 or 8 years. Now let's look at Congress. What are the changes going on in Congress? You all remember the song from the 50s, "Whatever Lola wants, Lola gets." Now, some argue that Lola is an 800-pound gorilla, but in a democracy, you and I are Lola. Whatever we want, we get. Well, apparently all we've wanted in the past 40 years has been deficit spending, and that's what we got. At least that's what Congress thought we wanted. And I remind you, Congress runs on its perception of what we want. If you don't tell it what you want, it doesn't know. A lot of you PACE delegates say, "Well, you didn't want deficit spending." Well, why'd you wait till November 1994 to say so? Because that's what Congress has interpreted. You were telling it in November of 94. We don't want any more deficit spending. If you'd been talking to Congress, maybe it wouldn't have taken them so long to figure out that you really did want a balanced budget. Or maybe you really don't want the budget balanced. What do you want? Most people in surveys show that they want the balanced budget, but only if you can balance the budget by cutting welfare and foreign aid. And the fact is, there's not enough money in either of those accounts to balance the budget. Most people don't fully realize what the pain is going to be involved in fully balancing the budget. So what is it you want Congress to do anyway? If you don't tell them, they can only guess, or alternatively, they can just let Washington's inside the Beltway lawyers tell them what you want. Some of you may be happy with that. I'm personally not very happy with that. While Congress talks a lot about public need, in fact, it's not focused on public need at all. It's focused on its perception of constituent need. It's assumed, and the system is designed on the premise that if constituents get what they need, then public need is satisfied. Now, in a couple of years, because of Senator Ross' legislation, for the first time, it's actually in law, agencies have to be worried about program outputs. Again, our speaker at lunch talked a bit about that. Everybody talks about program inputs. Now, engineers know a lot about outputs. You know, that's the arrow on the right-hand side of the box, the black box. And the input, that's the arrow coming into the box on the left-hand side. We engineers always have known that you measure a system by its output, what it produces, not its input, how much it spends. Curiously enough, that has not been a criteria whereby we have judged government. People talk about R&D spending, not what it produces. I think Congress is in a different mood. They're now worried about outputs. I claim that science and technology have had a 50-year honeymoon with Congress. Congress has been willing to fund anything that sounded reasonable, and we've been willing to promise whatever was necessary to get our R&D funds. I believe we've compromised our most important asset, our integrity, by making promises we couldn't hope to keep. Well, I'm sorry, I think the honeymoon is over. It's a new era. So what are some of the options available to IEEE? Our members are feeling the pain from this budget-cutting Congress, and they're asking IEEE for technology policy, better employment opportunities, improved public image, better ethics in the workplace, and improved pension terms. While this is all going on, some people in IEEE are seemingly doubting the value of a policy-oriented organization and challenging the need for IEEE-USA. I believe that the need for IEEE-USA has never been as great in this country as it is right now. However, that doesn't mean that IEEE-USA should remain just as it is today. I believe we need to impose a critical self-examination, and we need to follow that by a dramatic continuous improvement program. My recommendation is that IEEE becomes a risk-taking, and I realize that this is language that's in fact in conflict with all bureaucracies. Bureaucracies are in fact not risk-taking, they're not enterprising, but that's what we have to become. Risk-taking, enterprising, the term that I use is bureaucracy busting. I would recommend the writings of Jack Welch, chairman of General Electric, about what he's done to break up the bureaucracy at General Electric, so I think very insightful. We have to be willing to play hardball politics. That means we reward our friends and we punish our enemies. And I think we have to inspire members to become political activists. For this to happen, our members have to recognize that their future depends on this, and they have to come to understand that the policy-making process desperately needs their help. I believe the time has come for IEEE-USA to shift from an assertion-intensive perspective that employs only political processes to a knowledge-driven perspective that employs the scientific method. After all, it's the scientific method applied economically that engineers are good at, and that's what stirs their curiosity. Furthermore, it's our differentiating strength. If God had wanted us to spend our life asserting, she would have made our brains as small as lawyers. Lawyers can assert, we can think, so let's do it. By the way, do you know why lawyers' brains cost $100 an ounce and engineers' brains cost only $3 an ounce? It takes a lot more lawyers to get an ounce of brains, that's right. While admonishing our members to become political activists may be a necessary step, I don't believe it will produce a result if our members are not armed with arguments and data that meet the conditions of their critical analytical minds. I believe that the best long-term strategy is to provide our members with facts and data while simultaneously providing them with opportunities to help frame policy through journal publications and conferences. We have to search for and find ways to take advantage of our core assets of people, journals, and conferences in shaping policy. In other words, I think we need to define what our core capabilities are and identify ways to exploit those, and that's what I'm trying to do. I realize that I'm talking to PACE, not the U.S. Activities Board, but I believe that your effectiveness as policy leaders is tied to the IEEE-USA Activities Board. Policy work is not trivial. We have to provide you with materials. We at headquarters have to provide you with materials that have substance. I recommend that IEEE-USA create a policy-oriented think tank whose research specialties parallel that of our committees. Its imprint would show on all IEEE-USA policy recommendations. So I'd see establish a think tank, and there'd be an expert in that think tank affiliated with each IEEE-USA committee. And the work of the committee would be closely tied then to the research being done by the member of the think tank. I recommend that IEEE-USA create a policy review journal. By review journal, I mean a journal that doesn't emphasize original publications, but pulls policy papers published around the world technology policy papers that I would argue most engineers are not exposed to. In fact, I just visited Sandia's library earlier this week looking for policy journals, and every important policy journal that I have been following for the last several years, none of them are even in our library, which is otherwise an excellent library. But for the most part, policy literature is not something that technical people read. So I'm arguing that what we need to do is pull out the best policy papers and put them in our own review journal. I would recommend to you IEEE's Engineering Management Review Journal. Publishes often some of the best management papers written around the world in that review journal. So I'm looking at something like that. I recommend that we create a congressional scorecard so that our members know how their senators and representatives vote on issues that's critical to our members' future. I think we need to use the internet more to conduct policy surveys and make our members aware of the entity positions that are developed by our committees. And we need to leverage the resources of our members' employers and relevant trade associations. I estimate that a short course on how to influence Congress is needed and would be used by a large number of our members. To make better use of our people, I propose that we select government fellows with IEEE-USA interests in mind. We should stress that this is a training experience that's intended to help prepare the fellow for future policy work on behalf of the members of IEEE-USA. We should look for fellows that do not require IEEE financial support, so we minimize the stress on our financial system. I recommend that IEEE-USA committees begin to transition into knowledge-intensive, enterprising groups that find ways other than membership dues to cover their expenses. For example, they could run conferences like our societies do. I would argue that demonstrated policy knowledge should be a requirement for committee membership. I also recommend that each committee set a goal to develop one newsworthy item each year and get it published as an op-ed piece in a leading U.S. newspaper. Because some chapters and sections have been successful in developing a politically active membership, and I've heard about several of those at dinner and lunch, breakfast, I recommend that we conduct case studies of these politically active societies and chapters and find out what are they doing that many of the rest that aren't so successful aren't doing. What can we learn from that? We should make these case studies, make all of our sections aware of those case studies. I would argue that we need to establish a section and chapter's officer's position for government liaison that's part of that section's officer's progression to the presidency. I believe this would be a useful step in promoting political activism, and it would also make sure that every section head had been personally exposed to the political process and involved in it. If you're going to influence policy, I believe you need to read and write about policy. Perhaps our best developed resources is our journals. Yet these resources, I believe, are probably going to be the most difficult to change. I've had some conversations with one of our journal editors, and so far we're not communicating. I recommend that IEEE transactions, and we have several of them, make an attempt to cover one relevant technology paper in each publication. Again, IEEE transactions on engineering management does this. They've shown it can be done successfully. They've been doing that now for several years. I think it's time for our journal editors to get out of the box and quit behaving like classical technoids. It's time for our journal editors to treat technology policy and technology as partners. I would also recommend that authors of proceedings to the IEEE should be encouraged to write a section on policy issues that's relevant to the topic being addressed, and again, tied into the topic. I recommend that the Spectrum magazine expand its Washington Watch section, and it should start an Asia Watch section and a Europe Watch section. We'd like to know what's going on in the rest of the world, not just our own country. I think it's time to recognize that we live in a global economy, and what Europe does and what Asia does is important to our future. We'd like to know more about that. I think an IEEE tutorial book that highlighted technology and the policy issues that surround the technology would be useful to congressional staff. I think it would help our members increase their sensitivity to policy issues. I could see coordinating such a writing project through IEEE-USA committees, with each committee contributing a chapter relevant to the issues of the committee. Finally, I recommend that we make more use of our conference resources. I see basically two ways to do this. First, we could and should introduce sessions on international technology policies and policy at conferences sponsored by our societies. For 2-3 years, probably an invited-only speaker format would be required, but eventually you'd like to hope that this practice could be developed to the point where it could be driven largely by contributed papers. Second, some IEEE-USA committees have been successful in developing policy conferences that are well attended. Last year, the Healthcare Policy Committee sponsored a meeting in Washington that had about 250 attendees, and I think with better promotion we could probably have attracted twice as many people in attendance. And those were paid attendees, by the way. In no case has an IEEE-USA committee developed the conference management and promotion apparatus that exists in our societies. Most of our societies that I've been affiliated with plan conferences a couple of years ahead of time. They've got a conference committee. When I've been involved in that, I worked on the conference fully started 2 years before the conference took place. Our IEEE-USA committees work on a much, much tighter time scale and have not developed near as elaborate an apparatus, and consequently I don't think we get as much participation. I would also suggest that in those cases where our committees try to put on a policy conference and they fail, we need to look internally and say, gee, maybe the utility of that committee its relevance has run out. Maybe we don't need it anymore. Nobody's interested in the subject. Many IEEE conferences, and again, I've been involved with this at the society level, but many of our conferences have been successful in offering short courses. I suggest that we ought to put together a short course on how to lobby and introduce it at several IEEE conferences so our members could have firsthand experience and exposure with that. So what do we want to do next? I hope that some of the ideas that I presented here are useful for section and chapter leaders to implement independently of anyone else in IEEE. However, it is my intent that the Technology Policy Council adopt the policy that knowledge-intensive outputs are going to become their primary output. And I would like for you to put pressure on the Technology Policy Council to provide you with more research-based IEEE positions. I invite you to review my recommendations, eliminate those you don't like, and add ones that you do like. And I've asked Charles Lestard to appoint a committee and assign it responsibility to work with me and Mark here today to review these ideas and develop an implementation plan and a strategy for the recommendations that the committee endorses. Plus, obviously, committee members contribute their own ideas. If this notion of developing a grassroots involvement of our members in technology policy is worthy of the time that I put into researching it, then it's worthy of our taking action over the next 2 days. For once, let's leave an IEEE meeting with a clear plan of action defined, process owners identified, and a definition of what's going to happen next. I'd like to open the floor now for questions, but I'd like to leave you with a last reminder. You can either get involved and help make science and technology policy, or you can sit on your backsides and complain about what the lawyers are doing to you. I hope you do the former. Thank you.